breakfast, no breakfast, like dinner. Okay, then hopefully, ladies and gentlemen here are very nice with the dinner and also enjoy the dinner as well. And welcome again to the very last session of the symposia of ISWBC 2023. And I'm Rizka Afif as the host, and my role here to officially accompany ladies and gentlemen to enter and join the last session of our symposium, which is the special lecture, and will be assisted by our chairperson here, which has attended here together with us, which is Mr. Michael Patmanaba, or we usually call Pak Bono, right? Okay, then, make a noise to Pak Bono, ladies and gentlemen. Is it okay because of, we lack of participants, but then your soul and also your spirit are coming here together with us? And hello, Pak Bono.
Halo, selamat malam.
All right, selamat malam, Pak Bono. And directly go to Pak Bono. Time and screen are yours. Is it okay?
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Pak Bono.
Okay. Thank you, teman-teman, my dear friend. I would like to introduce first myself, although I'm sure most of you know me already. As he said, I'm Michael Patmanaba, and some people call me Bono, but sorry, Richard. Some people call me Bono, but Richard and some other may know me as Nobo, like nobody. Nobo and Bono, but don't call me Bonobo. So I'm now working at Kaleka as director of partnership, and I got my PhD from Xishuangbanna Tropical Botanical Garden, whose professor is with us now. So I would like to also introduce Richard Corlett. We are very honored to have you this evening, Richard. This evening our time, morning, afternoon your time maybe. And Richard is, as I said, he's my professor at Center for Integrative Conservation in Xishuangbanna Tropical Botanical Garden, Xishuangbanna, Yunnan province in China. Richard is emeritus professor in this institution. Prior to join XTBG, Richard has been being a scientist and lecturer in several universities, in National University of Singapore, University of Hong Kong, and Chiang Mai. He has a PhD from Australian National University. And here in this flyer is already very correct, mentioning Richard that in addition to many scientific papers, Richard has written several books, including The Ecology of Tropical East Asia, published by Oxford University, and Tropical Rainforest, an Ecological and Biogeographical Comparison, co-author with Richard Primack. Richard also a lead author of the Asia chapter in the Working Group 2, contribution to the 2014 IPCC-RR report, and for the IP-based regional assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services for Asia and the Pacific. So without too longer, I would like to invite Richard to have a guest lecture. So Richard, time and floors are yours.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure what to call you, Michael, Nobo, Bono. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm speaking now from London, which is surprisingly tropical. It's midday here, and it's about 32 degrees, which may be the hottest day this year so far. And we don't have air conditioning, so you're probably cooler than I am. I hope you can see my slides, and I hope you can hear me clearly. Is that true? You can see my slides and hear me clearly.
Yes, I can.
Good.
We can see your slide and hear your voice very clearly, Richard.
Good. So, although I'm speaking from London, and I was born in London, I spent almost all my adult life in tropical East Asia. So for 41 years, I lived inside that blue circle. I first visited tropical Asia about 50 years ago. And I refer to the region as tropical East Asia rather than Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia has a political meaning nowadays, while the ecosystems and biodiversity in southern China, northeastern India are very similar. So it makes sense to have a larger unit, which I call tropical East Asia. And as Nobo mentioned, I've published 3 editions of a book on this with Oxford University Press. So I first visited the region 50 years ago, 50 years this year. And in that 50 years, I've seen the expansion of oil palm into the tropical lowlands. I've seen the expansion of rubber north into northern mainland Southeast Asia and up into southern China. This plantation is actually in North Vietnam. And I've seen the expansion of many other crops. This is just coffee, tea, maize, cassava. A lot of these were originally planted for export from the region, but there's now more than 1 billion people of the region getting increasingly wealthy. So the region as a whole is it has a major internal market. I don't know how much of your coffee production you drink. I've also seen a large increase in hunting over the last 50 years, largely, I think, easier road access, easier access to weapons, and a huge increase in the use of snares, which I think were used much less 50 years ago. And there's been expansion in the wild animal trade, particularly in the wild bird trade, which has now really gone regional. There's also been a massive expansion in roads and other infrastructure throughout the region. Probably northern Myanmar, the only region left, which isn't crisscrossed with major roads and minor roads. There's been an expansion of mining, a spread of invasive species. And in the last few years, we're beginning to see the first signs of the effects of climate change within the region. Over the last 50 years, the region's warmed on average by about 1 degree centigrade. And we don't have the long-term records needed to detect the impacts very clearly, but some of them are very obvious, with species moving upslope, for instance. However, that's the bad news, and I could go on giving a whole lecture of bad news. I'm not going to. There's also a lot of good news about the region. The region's now much richer, it's much healthier, it's much better educated, it's much better governed. And the contrast between tropical East Asia and Europe has decreased over the years. When I first flew that distance 50 years ago, it was like going from one world to another. That's no longer true. You could commute between Bangkok and Rome or Jakarta and London. And apart from the climate and the food to some extent, there are a lot of similarities. Europe and tropical East Asia have similar population densities, similar birth rates, similar percentage forest cover, similar percentage protected area cover, national parks, nature reserves, etc. And many of the same environmental problems. So while 50 years ago, we're looking at very different situations, I think it makes sense now to look at conservation in tropical East Asia the same way it's looked at in Europe. So biodiversity conservation in tropical Asia for the last 50 years and longer, during the colonial period too, has focused on protecting large areas of supposedly undisturbed ecosystems. Usually they're not totally undisturbed, but they look undisturbed, mostly forests. And protecting charismatic vertebrates, the ones everyone knows: tigers, elephants, primates, hornbills, other species locally. And that's been the major focus of conservation. In December last year, your government, my government, all the governments for tropical East Asia were present in Montreal and agreed to expand global terrestrial protected area coverage to 30%, so that 30% of the planet would have a biodiversity priority, with suggestions that maybe this would need to be expanded to 50%. An obvious question to ask is 30% enough? Currently, global protected areas are about 18%. If we increase them for 30%, will that solve the problems with biodiversity conservation? Do we need 40% or 50%? Half Earth, as it's called. Maybe we need 60, 70%. Maybe we need to get rid of people altogether. I'm not going to propose that. It's an obvious question to ask. Is 30% enough? One of my PhD students at XTBG, Xishuangbanna Tropical Botanical Gardens, Nirunrat from Thailand, who is now in the National Parks Department in Thailand, she looked at this for Thailand. Will 30% be enough, as part of her PhD? So on the left, you can see a map of Thailand, surrounded by Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia down in the bottom. And the dark green areas are protected areas, national parks, nature reserves, etc., mostly called national parks in Thailand. Thailand has an excellent national park system. It covers 24% of the country, but it's mostly around the edges of the country, where there's fewer people and steep slopes and cooler environments. What Nirunrat looked at is, can we expand this to 30%? And what will the benefits of biodiversity be? So she worked out a plan, basically where dark green is the current protected areas, and red are the areas which she suggested expanding. And since she's a member of the National Parks Department, some of these will be protected, to increase it to 30%. So if Thailand adds the red areas to the dark green areas, this will increase the average size of the protected areas. It'll increase connections between protected areas, so species can move between them, and it'll increase the protection of threatened species. So this is a good thing. But if you look at that map of Thailand, even if we expand it to 30%, there's large areas of Thailand, which here I've circled in red, which are not protected. And there are many species which live in these areas which are not covered in the protected areas. So this includes the Gulf of Thailand around Bangkok in the center, where that narrow strip of shoreline, although it's developed for industry and ports, it supports huge numbers of seabirds, there's large mudflats, it's extremely important for migratory birds. In the Chao Phraya Delta and the Chao Phraya River system in central Thailand, there's small surviving patches of swamp forests and other wetlands. Most of it's just paddy fields. And then in eastern Thailand, there's no big areas of forest left. There's no tigers, there's no elephants, there's a few primates, just small patches. So none of these have been made into nature reserves. And I think this is true if you look at most countries in tropical East Asia. Even if 30% is protected, it will not be fully representative. and it will not cover all species. So the current focus in tropical East Asia of protecting large areas of supposedly undisturbed ecosystems, mostly forests, and protecting charismatic vertebrate species is good, and we need this, but it's not enough by themselves. Even if we extend it to 30%, it's still going to leave a lot of species unprotected. So what I want to talk about for the rest of the time is what I've called the next steps in my first slide. These are things which I think are done fairly well in Europe. They're done on a small scale in many places in tropical East Asia, but I think they need to be done more generally. So this includes top-down conservation assessment, identifying small areas for protection, and ecological restoration and rewilding. So let's start with top-down conservation assessment. Let's imagine the grey square is a small country. Obviously, Indonesia doesn't look like that. Maybe it's Singapore. Or it could be an island, Java, or maybe a province, could be West Java. An area which you can assess all of and you could get data for. Currently, we use a bottom-up approach. So we identify areas of high conservation value and we say we want that area, we want that area, we want that area, we want that area. And that's our conservation system. These are areas of high conservation value, but they also tend to be remote, sparsely populated, low agricultural value, too steep or too cold, or soil's bad or whatever, unstable. And this leaves a large area which is not protected. Now, the not protected areas, many of them have low conservation value. So this includes urban and industrial areas, intensive plantations, oil palm, rubber, other plantation crops. But it also includes areas which haven't been explored, which haven't been evaluated, which are difficult to protect. So it's possible that we're overlooking important habitats in this grey area because we've taken this bottom-up approach. Ideally, we'd take a top-down approach, assess the whole area using high-resolution remote sensing, using biodiversity data like the distributions of species. You could use sightings of birds in iBird. You can use vegetation maps, forest maps, road maps, spatial modeling, all the tools you could get. You can imagine doing this for Java, for instance, or for West Java. And then you assign protection on the basis of conservation value and social and economic constraints. So notice there'll always be social and economic constraints. It's not practical on, say, a small island with 200 million people. You can't give biodiversity priority everywhere. You have to take into account social and economic constraints. And then you need to update this at intervals as the changes in land use mean you need to change protection. But the advantage of starting with the whole area and then looking at everything to work out what's important is with this top-down approach to conservation assessment, you're less likely to overlook important areas. If you just say there, there, and there, well, maybe you didn't look at somewhere over there, which would have been important. Top-down approach ensures that you look at everything. we have the same problem with assessment at the species level. If we imagine the grey bar here is all the species in a particular group, all the birds, all the plants, all the primates, all the snails, all the butterflies or something, then the current bottom-up approach, we identify species of conservation concern, which are given some form of protection. So the ones in red, we've decided are threatened, and conservation activity is concentrated on those. But this leaves the majority of species. Some of them are least concern in the IUCN terminology, meaning they're no conservation concern. But some of them are just data deficient. We don't have enough data to assess their conservation concerns. Some of them weren't evaluated. We didn't evaluate invertebrates because we don't have anyone interested in them. Some of them are unknown. We don't know all the species anywhere. And some of them are certainly misidentified, and that happens everywhere. So again, if you take a top-down approach to conservation evaluation, then this is using the main IUCN categories. I've left off near threatened, just simplified it. There'll still be data deficient species. These are species we do not have enough information to evaluate their conservation status. But if they're flagged as data deficient rather than just grey, then we know they're a priority for research. Then we have least concerned species, which we don't have to worry about, and then increasingly vulnerable species, increasingly threatened species. Now, I'm not an expert on Indonesian biodiversity, but I would think, certainly for Java, and I think for most of Indonesia, if we're looking at birds, then it's possible to do this top-down conservation assessment now, and you've probably done it. So there are certainly birds in Indonesia which are still data deficient. We know roughly where they are, but we don't know much about their conservation concerns. But most birds can be evaluated. In contrast, if we're looking, say, at vascular plants or perhaps just at trees, in addition to a large number of data deficient species, which we've got in herbarium collections, but we don't know how common it is in the wild, there's many unknown species which still haven't been collected. So exactly what percentage of Indonesia's flora has been collected so far, I don't know. But it's perhaps 90%, perhaps a bit more. But that still leaves a lot of new species to be discovered. Those can't be evaluated, but we can at least estimate how many of those there are. And then if we took a group, here I've taken land snails, for which there may be very little data in much of Indonesia, then you're going to have a lot of unknown species, a lot of data deficient species, but you can still evaluate the rest. Now, one of the differences between Europe and Indonesia, and Europe and tropical East Asia, is Europe's got fewer species, only 6,000 vascular plant species in Europe. And it's got a lot more biologists, because every country in the EU has its own biologists, and in many cases, each state within their country has got them. So there will be hundreds of butterfly experts, hundreds of snail experts. And it's possible to do top-down evaluation for many groups. So this just gives examples of 6 groups that have been evaluated top-down in the European Union: vascular plants, butterflies, dragonflies, non-marine mollusks, that's basically snails, freshwater fish, and sapoxylic beetles. These are beetles that feed on wood. Also, of course, there's birds mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and several other groups like biophytes can be done. So you need a checklist for top-down conservation planning at the species level, but it doesn't have to be a complete checklist. It can have, I think if you've got at least 50% of the species, this is an exercise worth doing it top-down. And in Europe, this sort of exercise, doing these evaluations for different groups, has had a large impact on conservation. Because when you first evaluate, say, the dragonflies or the butterflies, you discover that there are areas, habitats, which are very important, which are not protected because they're not important for other species, but they're important for dragonflies or important for snails. When you take a top-down approach to conservation assessment, we tried to do this, Nirunrat tried to do this for Thailand, not very successfully, there's less data in Thailand. But you discover that many species that you thought would be protected are not protected adequately by the existing conservation system. This is what Europe's found, and it's what every country that does this finds. That if you take a top-down approach, you discover your conservation system is not conserving everything. This is where the second suggestion I've made, which is identifying and protecting small areas of high biodiversity value, comes into play. Currently, most protected areas in tropical East Asia are big. Many of them are huge. We don't have big protected areas in Great Britain where I live. They're all small. But in many countries in tropical East Asia, there are a few very large reserves. These are good, but there are large areas outside the protected area system. Even if you protect 30%, even if you protect 50%, half of the Earth for biodiversity, there'll still be habitats and species which are not represented. These are species which live in small patches of degraded habitat in populated areas, species in wetlands, small wetlands, particularly wetlands are badly protected throughout the region, other small habitats with specialist plants and animals. Limestone, ultra-basic outcrops, Indonesia's got a lot of, particularly in Sulawesi and parts of Borneo. Narrow linear habitats, strips along the coast or along riverbanks or along streams, but also small areas which may not be of very high biodiversity value in themselves, but could be very important for recreation and education. So if we go back to Thailand and look at these gaps in the current Thai protected area system, Thai only has really large nature reserves. But these areas still have forest. It's not very clear, I think, on the PowerPoint, but the light green areas in these are also forest. But the forest is in small patches, typically less than about 30 hectares, often on hills, and it's usually degraded, been cut for firewood, it's been burned, the animals have been hunted out. And yet there are species that live in these small areas which are not found in the bigger areas. Examples, I have two examples at the bottom. These are seabirds, shorebirds in the Gulf of Thailand. In the background, you can see temple and industry, but the mudflats are extremely important for millions of shorebirds. And then on the right bottom, there is a limestone karst, and individual limestone karsts can have species which occur nowhere else. Snails, lizards, sometimes plants, which are not found anywhere else at all. So protecting big areas does not protect things. The huge areas of forest protected in Western Thailand do not protect the shorebirds in the Gulf of Thailand. They do not protect the snails on limestone hills. So Thailand also needs a system of micro-reserves to fill in these protection gaps. This is just a rather different example. I thought I should give an example for London. This is Greater London. The area is what I live in. There's 10 million people in this map. And London has 1,571 local nature reserves. Those are the orange areas on the map. And they're mostly just 1 or 2 hectares. Some of them are considerably bigger than that. I have 2 of these within walking distance of where I live, and I actually went for a walk in one of them in the morning. So these are areas protected for biodiversity conservation, but also for nature education, for nature recreation. And the plan is that everyone in London can walk to a local nature reserve. So on this map, the orange areas are these local nature reserves. The black areas are areas of deficiency where you can't walk to a nature reserve within a couple of kilometers. So if you live in one of those black areas, you can't. I live in an area where you can, and just I have 2 with an easy walk and another one with a longer walk. And this shows some of the activities you can do in small areas. So some of these areas are important for conservation, but they're all also used for nature education. They're used by local schools. Nature education is part of the government school syllabus, so children have to go to nature reserves, and we have a lot of them, but also for walking, cycling, a whole lot of other activities. So these small areas are usually called micro-reserves. I think the idea originally started in Spain, and at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a sign for a plant micro-reserve in Spain. They're usually less than 50 hectares, often much less, and sometimes less than 1 hectare. They're usually controlled by local governments. It doesn't make sense for a national government to control a tiny area in a far corner of the country. So they're under local government control. And you have to have community involvement. If you don't, people will dump rubbish there, people will set fire to there, people will trap animals in them. So you need to have local community involvement. And they often depend on local volunteers. In my local nature reserves that I walk to, almost all the work's done by volunteers, although the local council pays for 2 people who do professional teachers who teach school children. Now, when you start protecting small areas like this, particularly in densely populated parts of the country, and tropical East Asia is almost all densely populated, these habitats are nearly always badly degraded. They've been burnt, trees have been cut down, firewood's been collected, and they need some form of ecological restoration. Sometimes ecological restoration is just a matter of leaving it alone. If you leave it alone, then it'll recover. But in many cases, it requires human intervention, and this often makes use of volunteers. So ecological restoration in tropical East Asia usually means tree planting. So these are 2 examples for which I've been to myself. On the left is a forest that was planted on degraded land 8 years before this photograph was taken. So this is an 8-year-old forest. It was planted with mixed native species. So there's about a dozen native species in there. On the right is an area in Hong Kong, and this was planted over a period of about 10 years. The older trees are nearly 20 years old, and there's about 60 or 70 different species in there. The blue things you see on the picture on the right are cylinders used to protect the seedlings and saplings against deer. So tree planting's good. You can restore habitat, but it has a lot of problems. It's very expensive. Restoring a hectare is practical, but restoring 1,000 square kilometers is not. It's just too expensive. You can't plant that many trees. It's only practical so in small areas, but also sites need to be accessible so you can get seedlings and saplings to plant. You almost always need local volunteers to help with tree planting. So this can be good for community involvement, but it does mean that you're getting a community forest, perhaps half a hectare, perhaps a hectare, but it's not a huge area. Also, it has a large failure rate, it has a low success rate. If it's done with great care, it can be very successful. But if you just go out and plant stuff, the first drought or the first fire will kill everything. However, the areas that need ecological restoration in tropical East Asia are huge. Tree planting, maybe we plant, I don't know, 10 square kilometers a year. That's in the whole region. I doubt we plant 10 square kilometers. Maybe we plant 5 square kilometers a year, if you add up the entire region. But the area that needs restoration in tropical East Asia is tens of thousands of square kilometers. And there's no way when you've got a landscape like in this picture, which is in northern Thailand, that you can plant this all up with trees. So we need to look at new approaches. I say new approach, but we actually need many new approaches. And I'm not going to say very much about this because really currently we don't know what to do. You may have some ideas on this. We've learned a lot about restoring small areas, perhaps up to a hectare, 2 hectares, perhaps up to a few hectares. But we know very little about exploring restoring landscapes on this scale. Part of it is just going to be leaving it alone. But you may need to plant trees in key areas, perhaps as buffers around key sites, as connectors between patches of remaining forest with fire breaks. You're going to need to manage fires almost everywhere in tropical East Asia. Fires are the enemy of forests, though in some cases, natural fires occur and the trees are resistant. But in the wetter areas, they're usually the enemy of trees. And you may also need to consider the reintroduction of keystone vertebrates where this is practical. There's been very little reintroduction of vertebrates in tropical East Asia. I don't know about in Indonesia. Most of the examples I know are when surplus animals which have been confiscated under CITES or taken from dealers or are released to the wild. But reintroduction in order to restore ecological processes is still rare. And it's becoming increasingly common in Europe. So I'll give examples. So this shows the release of a European bison. These are the largest land mammals in Europe. In the last interglacial, we had elephants, but for the last 100,000 years, we haven't had elephants, and bison are the biggest. And these are being reintroduced all over Europe to help restore ecological processes. Although they mostly graze, they also browse, they trample plants, they totally change the ecosystem and provide habitat for other species. In the UK, where I live, in Britain, beavers have been reintroduced. Beavers, which are large aquatic rodents, swimming rodents, which chew down trees to build dams over the river and create wetlands over streams. They became extinct in Britain 500 or 600 years ago. There are still rivers in London which are named after beavers, Beaverbrook, because they used to have beavers, but they haven't for 500 or 600 years. Now we've started to reintroduce them. So far, we haven't reintroduced anything bigger, but beavers are already restoring wetlands in Britain. There are current applications to reintroduce the European lynx, which has been extinct for 600-700 years. The lynx is a medium-sized cat. It's no danger to people, but it can kill sheep. It can certainly kill pets, and it's very controversial. Reintroduction of wolves, which became extinct in Britain 1,000 years ago, also highly controversial and probably won't happen. And you'd have the same thing. Think about reintroducing tigers to Java. The Javan subspecies of tiger is extinct, but maybe you could reintroduce tigers from Sumatra, which are fairly similar. I don't think that would go down very well. But there are always species which can help restore ecological processes. So in Europe and in North America, the concept of rewilding is basically when you're restoring ecological processes rather than species. So if you rewild an area, you may reintroduce European bison, perhaps one or two other species, but then you can leave it alone and leave it to nature. So you're restoring processes rather than restoring species. So this is different from planting trees, where every tree in the ground is one you planted. Here, every tree in the ground has passed through a natural seed dispersal agent, which you've reintroduced. So, to summarize, we still need large protected areas. And I think the agreement in Montreal at COP15, the CBD's COP15, to try and protect 30% of terrestrial land area by 2030 is a good target. And if you look at the details, this doesn't have to be absolute protection, excluding people. So this includes quite a wide range of things that can be included in this 30%. Large vertebrates still need special protection. You can't keep tigers or elephants without a special effort. It's not, you can't put them in small 50-hectare nature reserves. They need a special effort. So we still need to protect large areas of undisturbed ecosystem. We need to protect charismatic vertebrate species. I would say that in addition to the undisturbed ecosystems, which we basically run out of in tropical East Asia, we need to protect large areas of log forest, which will recover, and areas which have been subject to shifting cultivation, but which are now abandoned. So the threshold for protection needs to be low. We need to allow for past disturbance and recovery. But tropical East Asia has the capacity and resources to do more. And I've suggested 3 ideas. I've taken these ideas largely from Europe. They're all being done somewhere in tropical East Asia, but it's only in Europe they've been done on a really large scale. The scale, European Union is the same size as tropical East Asia. And this top-down conservation assessment has been done for the whole of Europe, so it covers every country. Small areas of biodiversity are protected in most countries, and ecological restoration, rewilding is going on in most countries. But there's also a lot of other possibilities. I'm sure you have other ideas. I've just picked these 3 because I don't want to talk forever and ever, and I could come up with some others, but I think these are the most important of my suggestions. So I'd like to stop there and take questions. I can take questions now if anyone's interested. If they want to correspond further, best to email me on my Gmail address. My XCBG address doesn't always work. I have a few copies of my Ecology of Tropical East Asia book, which I'd be happy to give to libraries. If you want a personal copy, you're going to have to buy your own, I'm afraid. They're too expensive to give away, but I can certainly give to libraries. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Richard, for the very insightful lecture this evening. And yeah, it's still about tropical Asia conservation, biodiversity. So here we are in the room, and we also have some participants online. So, and also the one from that watched our lecture through YouTube streaming. But I would give first opportunity to those who are attending this lecture online. You can please to ask question or you want to comment from Richard's lecture this evening. Also, you can also type your question or any comment in the chat box. We can show later and translate if necessary. So for you friends who are online, do you have any question? Please open your mic. Any of you? Ada nggak chat box-nya? Hah? Buka aja. While waiting, I would so that to save time. Hah? Mana? Oi.
Yeah. May I have question? Hey.
Silakan, Mas Imron.
Yes. Pak Richard, Prof. Richard, thank you very much for very insightful thought for biodiversity conservation, particularly the challenge on biodiversity conservation in tropical regions. I think it's opened our mind that that this top-down and bottom-up approach will be we call it our future challenge for biodiversity conservation. Just wondering, because I'm actually the college of Pak Sandy, and I'm working a lot with wildlife conservation. I would like to know your opinion and also your thought about how movement ecology branch of ecology will be developed in the future, and how can movement ecology can help us to understand the what you call, in your example, the connectivity among area. But do you think this movement ecology will be still important still in the future for biodiversity conservation in tropic? And what are the
Yes.
challenges? Please, thank you.
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. And yes, one of the things that I didn't mention that's changed in the last 50 years is we have many more tools. And obviously, movement ecology has made use of these tools. Obviously, radio telemetry, camera traps, genetic methods, and everything. And I think it's becoming increasingly possible to track large numbers of individuals fairly cheaply. I don't know whether that's true in Indonesia, but I have seen studies that have done this. Yeah, I mean, movement ecology is essential for understanding how vertebrates use space. It's less important for invertebrates, which are moving within a small area. It's obviously not important for plants, which are, well, it's important for plants for seed dispersal, movement inside animals. But the term connectivity doesn't make sense without movement ecology. Connectivity for what? What moves down this connection? Is it carrying seeds? What effects does it have? So yes, I mean, movement ecology has become a core discipline in conservation biology. And I think it's changed our way we look at things. And I think this is particularly interesting. And I talked about small nature reserves, which tend to be highly isolated. So you've got a small patch and then another small patch a long way away. In fact, when you use radio telemetry on mobile animals, they're often moving actually between small nature reserves. And it's surprising how connected these areas can be. You may get individual birds, mammals that move at night. We have foxes, for instance, move within, foxes and badgers move between small nature reserves in London, 2 kilometers of urban areas. So, I mean, basically you can't conserve vertebrates unless you know how they're moving.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Imron. Imron is my colleague in Faculty of Forestry Gajah Mada University, Richard, and he's now also working in WWF Indonesia. Any other question from participants, online or online first? Any? Itu jangan coba maju langsung, baik. Any? Yeah. Name and introduce your institution, please.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Richard Corlett, yeah, I'm sorry for the spelling. I'm Nurahim from the Faculty of Forestry in Gajah Mada University. I want to ask you a question about how we can ensure the community-based conservation to protect the biodiversity, because we know in Indonesia, especially in Southeast Asia, and more specific in Indonesia, like Sumatra or Java and Kalimantan, the people around the conservation area are not conserving the biodiversity. Still, the resource from the forest and like etc. Because they need to increase their economy. And like the question, how we can ensure the community-based conservation to conserve the biodiversity in the forest. Thank you.
Obviously, that's a very, it's a very good question, and it's a key question in the region. It's not really something I can answer. I mean, it requires local knowledge, which I don't have for Indonesia. In areas where I've worked myself, the situation varies so much from area to area that you need different approaches depending on who you're working through. So sometimes you can work with religious organizations, sometimes you can work with schools, sometimes you can work with local government departments if they have good relations with local communities. I don't think there's an answer that fits everywhere. So I think if you're setting up small local nature reserves under local control, these things need to be negotiated with local communities. But this only works if the local community can enforce rules they've agreed to. So if a local community controls a forest patch, then they can decide what's done in it. But if outsiders can come in, then the villagers themselves gain nothing from protecting it, because then its resources are taken from by outsiders. So this is a difficult situation. There's no general answer, and all across the world, this is a problem. It becomes less of a problem in wealthier countries as more people work away from home and are not dependent on local resources. But obviously this varies hugely in the region. And I should say, though, that often, although local resources may be very important for livelihoods, a lot of hunting within the region, even by rural people, is recreational rather than hunting for food. And it's noticeable if you ask hunters in southwest China, but also in Laos, which is one of the poorest countries in the region, or in northern Thailand, the major reasons they give for hunting are tradition, it's fun, it's healthy, rather than necessity. Some resources are needed, firewood. So I think some sort of agreement which allows sustainable use is necessary. But I realize this is often not possible. And if there's no other source of income, there's no other source of resources, then nature is going to continue to be depleted. So I'm afraid that doesn't answer your question. It is very, very difficult.
Okay, cukup. Sip. Okay.
Perhaps I should add to that. There's a saying which all conservationists should remember. All conservation is local. There is no global conservation. It doesn't matter what's decided in Montreal. All conservation is local. You've got to make it work locally.
Okay, Richard. There is one question from the chat room. It's also related to the one that you just mentioned about conservation local. The question is local nature reserve need recognition from central government? In Indonesia, conservation area is a land owned by state government and managed by government. And how about source, fund, human resource, etc., to manage local nature reserve?
Yeah, I mean, this varies between countries, but no, it's not essential. It's recognized on a national scale. As long as you've got a local government which is able to negotiate with local people and ensure continued protection, then it doesn't need to be agreed nationally. I mean, a major problem in many countries, and this we discover in Thailand, for instance. In Thailand, protections under the National Parks Department, but they're not set up to protect micro-reserves on the fringes of urban areas. So these really need a separate, need to be done in a separate government department. In the UK, local nature reserves, like the local nature reserves in London, are not controlled by the national government. The national government keeps a registry, they have a list, but they're controlled by the local boroughs, which are the divisions of London which for local government. So I think national control of small areas doesn't work. It's got to be local.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So again,
I should add to that, sorry, one other thing, that national governments can provide a lot of help. So in Spain, although micro-reserves are set up locally, the national government provides some funding, it provides advice, it can provide links with people who can help with particular things. So national governments can help, but they can't control it.
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Richard. So again, teman-teman yang mau online, if you want to ask, just feel free to open your mic and just interrupt. It's okay. There's another question from the chat room, Richard, that in your opinion, what is the most reasonable approach to solving ecological problem in the Southeast Asia region, considering that social conditions are very diverse, especially at the level of education?
I mean, these are all good and very difficult questions. When I gave lectures on conservation, when I was starting out as a young conservationist 30, 40 years ago, I used to say that we should focus on education and the future was our children. But the future's caught up with us. The future is now. We have to do things now. We can't wait for our children. So we have to provide a better world for our children. But I think the diversity of ecological problems in Southeast Asia, the diversity of social conditions, obviously means that decisions can't be made at the regional level. Sometimes they can't be made at the national level. I think that would probably apply to Indonesia, which is the most diverse country in the region. For education, there are big advantages in having a national syllabus so that every child in a country learns basically the same things. But the national syllabus in the UK and the national syllabus in many countries requires that school children learn in local protected areas. But it doesn't say they don't have to learn about tigers if there's no tigers. They don't have to learn about specific species. So they need to learn about how ecosystems work, They need to learn that there are different ecosystems and different species require different things. But there isn't a set list you need to study. So I think a national syllabus is a good idea. And I think a requirement for learning in protected areas where they're available should be part of every national syllabus. And I think it is in many countries. In China, it's been very difficult to get school children working in protected areas because the parents worry it'll be dangerous, they'll get bitten by something, or but I think every country in Europe requires it. And I think it's important that children learn outdoors. So I would set general national guidelines, but the precise content is going to have to be local.
Okay, thank you, Richard. By the way, before it's too long, I would like to use my privilege as a chairperson tonight, this evening, and of your former student, Richard. I would like to ask, because now I'm working in an organization working to promote sustainable commodities. So from ecology, from invasive species, now I work in the area of sustainability. We define sustainability if the commodity are managed while reducing deforestation, reducing fire, reducing social conflict. It can protect the high conservation value, and it also empower local community, including farmer and indigenous community. That's what we believe as what sustainability are. So now we are working in Central Kalimantan, where we will currently we support we working to promote sustainable palm oil under RSPO, Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, but also we are going to promote coconut, rubber, and timber sustainable. So my question is, do you think sustainable palm oil is possible? Because I also doubt if really is it sustainable. What do you think? I would like to hear your advice, Richard.
Okay, I mean, clearly, if you went back 50 years and said that oil palm could not involve any deforestation, then we'd have very little oil palm. And instead, you'd be cooking with soybean oil, which would be destroying the Amazon forest, or you'd be cooking with some other form of oil. Oil palm not only makes a huge amount of money, but it produces a huge amount of oil in a small area. And as long as the world needs edible oils, then we have to learn to produce them in a way which doesn't cause any more environmental damage. So I think if you can grow oil palm on areas that we deforested in the past, and not expand into new forest areas, and you can avoid problems like erosion, pesticide drift, etc., then you're doing an environmental service not only to Indonesia but to the world. I mean, the world needs edible oils, and none of the alternatives are good, or none of them are better. But so we have to accept that we're moving towards a world with at least 10 billion people, of which more than 1 billion will be in tropical East Asia. And these people have to be fed, they have to be provided with other resources they need for living. I have a cotton shirt, and I've just drunk coffee before starting my talk. I had rice for lunch. So, and these are all produced on land which did support natural ecosystems in the past and no longer does. So this is why I think this top-down approach to conservation is very important, because simply expanding the area for nature so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and intensifying agriculture in the remaining area, it'll be good for many species, perhaps 2/3 of species, but we'd still lose an awful lot. And although the species in local nature reserves in London are mostly not national important and certainly not globally important, they are important for the people who go there. So a top-down approach focusing on species and habitats ensures that you get enough habitats protected, that species have sufficient habitats to survive, and then sustainable crop production, commodity production can occur in the other areas. But I think there's certainly a risk if we go on the way we are now, this bottom-up approach, that a lot of things that we don't think are endangered now or we don't know about are going to become endangered in the future, and things are just going to get worse and worse. So I don't know if that answers the question. Obviously, reducing the environmental impact of the world's major crops, oil palm, obviously rubber, coffee, tea, cocoa, coconuts is extremely important. But like all conservation activities, it will not be enough. We need all these things. We can't just say, do this, or do this, or do this. We've got to do them all, and we've got to do them now.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Another question from the chat room. Greetings. I was interested how the microecology that you presented. Does the implementation always started by planting which has fast growth? If it does, how about the strategy of overlooked species that need to be conserved but has a slow growth? Does it possible to be applied on microecology or need the other strategy? Thank you in advance.
Okay, by microecology here, does this mean micro reserves, small protected areas? So micro reserves, small reserves, basically are most important for plants and for invertebrates, which can maintain viable protections, populations in small areas. They may also be important for large vertebrates that are mobile and move between micro-reserves. But it doesn't have to be species with plant growth, with fast growth. So on extreme soil types, and many of the small protected areas, many of the ones in London, are in particularly poor soils, and this is true in many parts of the world. And plants grow very slowly. So the danger of ecological restoration with fast-growing plants is certainly that you may overlook slow-growing plants. And I mean, that's certainly a problem. And it's one of the problems with tree planting, because while in theory you could plant hundreds of different species, in practice, growing large numbers of seedlings or saplings of hundreds of species impossible. And you end up with a lot of seedlings of about sort of 10 species or maybe 20 species. And these tend to be the ones that grow easily and grow fast. And you can end up with very homogenized areas, restoration areas. So this certainly is something you want to avoid. Homogenization occurs very easily if you favor quick-growing species. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Anyone from this room want to ask questions?
Hi, Richard. My name is Ardian. I'm from DICE, University of Kent. So if I may, I have two questions. The first one would be, what do you think the impact of, like, in the future, like the largest economy in the world would be like coming from Asia, China, and India. What do you think this growing economy would affect the biodiversity conservation, not only in Asia, but in the world? The second one would be our world, the government already commit quite a lot, 30% conservation expansion, reducing the the carbon emission, and the increase in temperature. From your past experience, I'm just wondering, like, how optimistic you are with the future of our biodiversity.
Okay, that's a nasty question at the end. For the influence of China and India, if you'd asked me 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I think, even 10 years ago, I would have been very pessimistic because they're huge economies focused on growth. And India, both of them producing massive amounts of coal, burning huge amounts of other fossil fuels, building roads, etc., extremely fast. However, that's changed. And certainly, I can't speak so much for India, though I think it's true too. But in the last few years that I was in China, this concept of ecological civilization, which I'll get someone else to explain, it's written into the national constitution in China. So local governments are obliged to take into account ecological civilization when making decisions. And this includes concepts like sustainability. It includes rather more than sustainability, but conservation and sustainability are in there. And I think experience of the older generation in China, the ruling generation, is they remember when China was beautiful. They remember when you could swim in rivers, and people my age remember when the fields were full of birds, the paddy fields were full of fish and whatever. That's no longer true. The country is heavily polluted, agriculture extensive, very intensive, rivers all polluted. And I do think there is now a serious attempt to reverse this damage. And I think in this way, China is following partly the trajectory that was followed by Europe, particularly by Eastern Europe, where you've seen a massive transformation over the last 20 years. I think this will happen in India too. What influence it'll have on biodiversity conservation in the rest of the world, I don't know. Obviously, China used to act as a major sink for importing tropical timber, often illegally, pangolins, a whole lot of tiger bones, tiger skins, all sorts of things. And effort has been made to bring this under control. As for optimism for the future, if you're a conservationist, you've got to be an optimist. If you're not an optimist, you probably should give up, because you have to believe that what you're doing well will work, what you're doing now will work, and that you can make the world better. Or if you can't make the world better, you can help other people make the world better. So I'm an optimist. And certainly one of the major changes on my list of changes for the region is that you can now talk to people about the environment, about ecology, about conservation, about sustainability. And this is not in English. I speak Thai fairly well. I could talk in Thai on these things. I can't speak in Bahasa, but I'm sure you can speak in Bahasa on these topics. 50 years ago, you couldn't really. And politicians, normal people, you just couldn't talk about these things. And I've been struck over the last 5 or 10 years how much an understanding of global, national, and local environmental problems has diffused down into the grassroots and thus up into politicians. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the UK, and just seeing it in tropical East Asia. I've certainly seen it in China. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Others? Question? Coba bukain ini. In this room? No? There is one from the chat room, Richard. Thank you, Professor Richard, for the very insightful presentation. What I get is that rather than planting seedling and trees, you would recommend ecological restoration or rewilding. But when it comes to measuring the effort put in and the progress made, isn't this more difficult and more debatable? Would you like to give more explanation and example of this, especially in government point of view? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that is an extremely good question. I'm certainly not opposed to planting seedlings and trees, and we need to do more. I'm just saying that what we're doing is never going to be enough. We can't plant 10,000 square kilometers of degraded land every year. It's just, that's trillions of trees, and it's just not possible to do. And it's certainly true that one reason why tree planting is so attractive to governments is that you can count what you've done. You can say, we planted 10,000 trees. Better still, you can come back in 3 years and say, we planted 10,000 and 6,000 still survive. You can't do that with a larger scale landscaping approach. And what metrics, how you measure the added value from restoring processes rather than species is very difficult. I've actually written a book chapter on this for a book on rewilding by Cambridge University Press. So if you email me, I can send the book chapter, but it's mainly aimed at Europe, where this is a big issue. So if your aim is to plant 10,000 trees or 150 species, then at the end of a period, it can be assessed. You can audit it. How do you audit? So you can audit a restoration project. But how do you audit a rewilding project? And it's difficult, and I've written a book chapter on this, but it's you just need to have different standards. In Europe and in Britain, and in many countries, separate countries in Europe, there are NGOs, Rewild in Europe, Rewild in Britain, Rewild in Scotland, which really focus on this, and they usually work with local governments. And they try and raise money sort of from outside government systems, because it's understood it is very difficult for a government to budget rewilding on and to get it through auditors. So yes, that's a very good question. But if you email me at my Gmail address or my XTBG address, I can easily be found by Googling my name. I can send you the chapter.
Okay. One more question. I would love to hear some advice from you. Currently, I'm doing my job that is supervising the botanical garden managed by local government, specifically in Java Island. If we want to carry out the assessment in botanical gardens, where should we begin? And is there a basis for consideration or guideline in carrying out this assessment? As we know that there are not only conservation value, but also research, education, as well as ecological value provided by botanical garden. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent last question. I worked in botanical gardens in China for 9 years, and I was involved in this sort of assessment. I mean, we asked ourselves, what is the botanical garden doing, and what should we be doing? And what can a botanical garden do that other institutions that cannot? What can it do that a nature reserve doesn't do, that a public park doesn't do, that an NGO doesn't do, that a research institution doesn't do? I don't have time to talk about that now, but again, if you email me, I could send you some ideas on this. But many global botanical gardens have looked at these issues. And Botanic Gardens International, BGCI, have, I think, now produced guidelines which you can apply. I'm not sure. I haven't seen their website. But if you look at the BGCI website, and you can register with BGCI and you can get advice from them, then they're a good source of advice. At XTBG, we actually, which has a lot of money, we flew in heads of botanical gardens from all around the world. We had 5 heads or deputy or science managers of botanical gardens in different parts of the world. And we had this whole committee advise the garden on what they could do. Now, that's very ambitious, but XTBG is huge. It's 11 square kilometers. So I currently work part-time at Kew Gardens, which is also big, and ask exactly the same questions every year, because it has to justify to the government, why should you support a botanical garden? What is a botanical garden? So, yes, again, that's a question I could provide more help through an email, probably.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We will send you email for any further clarification or question. Any others? I think we are approaching the end of time, so I would give one last question. Any of you in this room or in online? Any burning question? Nggak ada, Mas. Okay, Richard, I think we have all of need to ask, then, but again, we will certainly send you email for further question, if any. And I think this is the last of our lecture. Again, thank you so much. We are very honored that you are with us this evening, this afternoon in your time, to have a very great lecture about tropical Southeast Asia conservation and the next step. Again, thank you very much. I would give the time and to the MC. Silakan ditutup. Give applause to Richard.
All right, I thank you, Dr. Richard, and as well as Dr. Michael for assistance. Very good, since I love the discussion. It's very interesting, a lot of questions coming. But sadly, we are on last session, which we would like to close the closing. And thank you again, Babono, for...
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Give applause again to Babono.
And Richard.
Okay, and also Dr. Richard as well. Thank you so much for giving your time here for the new insight for us together. Very insightful. And yeah, this is the end from Mbak Sabila.
Okay, thank you. We would like to thank our organizers and sponsors for making ISWBC 2023 a success. Before we conclude, on behalf of the committee of ISWBC 2023, we would like to thank each and every one of the participants for your active participation the last 3 days. We hope to see you again next year in ISWBC 2024. Until then, we wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Afif and I would like to sign off as the Master of Ceremony. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.
Thank you all. Again, thank you, Richard. Until we meet again. Bye-bye. Terima kasih semua teman-teman.
Thank you all. See you in 2025, actually.
25,
yeah.
not 24, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for coming here in ISWBC 2023. Hope we could see you again in 2025. All right. Okay. We would like to take a picture together for the last session. Or not? I think yes. Let's go. With the all organizing committee, since this is the last session and we have to capture. Yeah, okay then. Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. See you again and have a good rest after this. Thank you so much for these 3 days valuable event. And so sorry for our mistaken during the event and also symposia. And we are to thank you for the organizing committee for giving us the chance to become the Master of Ceremony as well. Thank you.
Can we leave?
Yeah, sure. You could. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm leaving.